Thanks for being here. Doesn't feel like spring to me. I think that's agreement. Today's message is titled God's Providence. Joseph and God's Providence. God is sovereign. Providence means that God is in charge, whether we realize it or not. Some things are true whether we realize it or not. Some things are true whether we believe it or not. But God is in charge. He's in charge of everything. He is sovereign. Joseph and God's providence. If you'll remember, just a little bit of review, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son, but he was not the child of promise. Ishmael settled in what is now known as Iraq. The Arabians claimed descent from Abraham through Ishmael. The Jews, the Israelites, and the Christians, us, we claim descent from Abraham through Isaac, the child of promise. Isaac had a son. Well, he had twins. Rebekah, his wife, had twins. Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob was the secondborn of the twins. Jacob was grasping the heel of Esau. Esau was a godless man, and he married Hittite women who God had instructed them not to marry because they worshiped foreign gods. And God said, if you worship people who follow foreign gods, they will turn your heart from me. Esau did this knowing that he wasn't supposed to. And then later on, in spite, Esau married a descendant of Ishmael. So, Jacob is the son of Isaac. So we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that is how God identifies himself. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob has to flee because Jacob means, what does Jacob mean? What is the name? Deceiver. Jacob is a deceiver, and his brother Esau swears he's going to kill Jacob. So Jacob must flee, and he goes to his mother's uncle's place, to the land where his mother's uncle lives, Laban. Jacob comes to his uncle Laban, and Laban has two daughters. The older is Leah, and the younger is Rachel. Jacob falls in love with Rachel. And Jacob says to his uncle Laban, I will work for you for 7 years in return for Rachel to be my wife. And Laban agrees. He says, okay, work for me for 7 years and Rachel will be your wife. And the Bible tells us that Jacob was so much in love with Rachel that those 7 years seemed like just a few days. That's how much he loved Rachel. The night of the wedding comes, and Jacob is there, and they bring his bride, and she's in the bridal clothes, which means her face there's a veil over her face. And Jacob doesn't realize it, but it's Leah under the veil. His uncle Laban turns out to be even more of a deceiver than he is. And the deceiver's been out deceived by his uncle. And Jacob marries Leah, thinking that he's marrying Rachel. When Jacob realizes, they go to the bridal chamber, and Jacob realizes, this isn't Rachel, I've been tricked. A little bit of his own medicine, actually. Laban says to him, Laban sees that the Lord has blessed Jacob. Jacob's been with him for 7 years. And Laban sees that the Lord has blessed Jacob. So Laban says, I'll let you take Rachel as well. It's our custom that the older gets married before the younger. But I'll let you take Rachel as well if you agree to work for me for 7 more years. Because Laban sees that the Lord is blessing Jacob. So Jacob agrees. So we have this semi-happy family. Leah turns out to be, I don't know what the correct word would be, but she has children easily. Rachel cannot have children. So through Leah and her two maidservants, Jacob has 10 sons. 10 sons are born to him. But Rachel cannot have children. So just like his father Isaac, and just like his father Abraham, Jacob prays for his wife, Rachel, the one that he loves, so that she may have children. God honors the prayer, and Rachel bears Jacob a son. And his 11th son, Jacob's 11th son, is Joseph. Joseph is the first son of the woman that Jacob loves dearly. Joseph. So naturally, or well, as fate, whatever, Jacob loves Joseph more than the other sons. Of the 11 sons, Joseph is undoubtedly Jacob's favorite because he's the son of the woman that he loves. So you quite naturally can guess that Joseph's 10 brothers come to resent him because he's the father's favorite. And it comes to the point where they actually hate him. How many of you have ever heard of Joseph in the Technicolor dream coat? Well, that's not quite biblical, but Jacob does make a tunic for his son that shows his favor on Joseph. So here you have Joseph come to be hated by his older brothers because he's Jacob's favorite. And when Joseph is 17 years old, he has a dream from God. And that's where we'll pick up the story of Joseph. But in your notes, there's a scripture. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 and 29. This is the foundation. This is the foundation of today's message. This is a promise from God through the Apostle Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, who is us. And we know that in some things, no. We know that in all things, good things, bad things, good things, even mistakes that you've made, we know that in all things, that includes mistakes, that includes bad things that have been done to us. When Jesus died on the cross, He redeemed your sins for the present, the future, and Jesus also redeemed your past on the cross. The devil is our accuser, and the devil will try to bring up your past. But Jesus redeemed our past on the cross. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. If you're here today, you have been called according to God's purpose, whether you realize that or not. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of His Son. That's God's objective for all of His children, to be conformed into the likeness of His firstborn Son. Conformed to the likeness of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. So we pick up the story of Joseph, and in your notes, it says Joseph was Jacob's, whose name was changed to Israel after his encounter with God. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. Joseph dreamed one night that his brothers were bowing down before him. He receives a dream from God that his brothers are bowing down before him. Now his brothers already resented Joseph because he was their father's favorite. But after hearing the dream, they wanted to kill him. Now, I've written on my notes, I've numbered the events that happen. Remember, we're talking about God's providence, how God is in charge, how He works out everything for our good. This is number 1. Jacob tells his brothers his dream, and they want to kill him. This is the first event that God is in charge of. I've heard many people say that it was a mistake that Joseph told his brothers, and I've heard it preached from the pulpit, and I'm not saying that I disagree with it, but I've heard it preached many times that some things God tells us it's just for us to know, not for others, and that it was a mistake. Joseph was making a mistake by telling his brothers. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it was a mistake. God is in charge. But this is the first event. And if Joseph had not told his brothers, none of the other things that happen in the future would have happened. Okay? So the first event, he tells his brothers, I had a dream that you were all bowing down before me. They got mad and they wanted to kill him. They ended up selling him to merchants who were on their way to Egypt. That's the second event. They sell him to merchants who are on their way to Egypt. After selling their brother, Jacob's sons tell him that his favorite son is dead. Joseph is 17 years old when he is sold into slavery. So at the very least, we have 2 events here in our story. He's sold. From Genesis chapter 37, verse 28. When the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern. They'd thrown him in a well, and Reuben, they were going to kill him, but Reuben talked them into not killing him. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Now, Ishmaelites are descendants of Ishmael who have married Arabians. Ishmael settled in what is now known as Iraq. So he's sold to Ishmaelites who take him into Egypt. Things aren't looking good for Joseph at this point. Things are not looking good for Joseph at this point. Genesis chapter 37, verse 36, this is in your notes as well. This is the third event that I've numbered. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So at the very least, we now have 3 events. He's sold to Potiphar, who is an official, Pharaoh's official, he's the captain of the guard. Things are not looking good for Joseph. Potiphar has a wife. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph. Again, this I'm reading from your notes. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph, so he put him in charge of the entire household. Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. He refuses. She frames him for attempted rape. Joseph ends up in prison. This is the 4th event. She seduces him. He refuses. She accuses him of rape. Now he finds himself in prison. Out of the cistern into prison in Egypt. We have at least 4 events now that are not looking good for Joseph. Genesis chapter 40, verse 4. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker also find themselves thrown into prison. So while Joseph is in prison, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and the chief baker, they do something to make Pharaoh mad, and they find themselves in prison. Okay? And it says in Genesis chapter 40, verse 4, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. So now we have the 5th and the 6th event. The cupbearer and the baker are thrown in prison, and Joseph is put in charge of these 2. The 5th and 6th event. Doesn't look good for Joseph, but God's in charge. God's in charge. We have at least 6 events now. Maybe God's made a promise to you in the past, and maybe it doesn't look too good. Maybe you've made mistakes in the past, and it doesn't look too good. Maybe things are tough right now, and it doesn't look too good. But God is in charge. God is bigger than the problem, bigger than the mistake, whatever mistake you've made. He's even bigger than whatever dream you might have. God is bigger than your dream. Don't lose hope. Don't lose heart. Don't lose faith. Don't lose patience. I've put that in your notes. It would be easy for Joseph to think, wow, I'm completely forgotten by everyone, including God. Joseph sits in prison. Now, the seventh event. The cupbearer and baker both have dreams in the same night. This is the seventh event. Joseph, through God's help, interprets their dreams. That's the eighth event. God enables Joseph to interpret their dreams for them. One of the dreams is very good. One of the dreams, it's very bad for that person. The cupbearer is restored to his position, which Joseph told him. Your dream means that you're going to be restored to your position. It didn't work out so well for the baker. But the cupbearer is restored to his position as Joseph had foretold, but he forgets Joseph. That's the ninth event. We're up to 9 events. Number 7, I have number 7. The cupbearer and the baker have dreams. Number 8, God gives Joseph the interpretation of those dreams, and the cupbearer is restored to his position. Event number 9. But he forgets Joseph. He forgets Joseph. Joseph sits in prison still. Don't lose heart. Don't lose hope. Don't lose faith. Don't lose patience. Eventually, event number 10, eventually Pharaoh himself has 2 disturbing dreams. None of the magicians or wise men of Egypt could interpret the dreams. Then the cupbearer. Pharaoh's had 2 very disturbing dreams. He calls the magicians and the wise men, but they can't interpret the dreams. The cupbearer remembers that Joseph can interpret dreams. That's event number 11. The cupbearer remembers, hey, I know a guy who can interpret dreams. And then Pharaoh has Joseph summoned from prison. That's event number 12. The cupbearer says, I know someone who can interpret your dreams, Pharaoh. So Pharaoh has Joseph summoned from prison. In Genesis chapter 41, verse 14, this should be in your notes. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. Quickly brought from the dungeon. It only takes God 1 second to bring about what he has been working out for years. Is that in your notes? Because this is stuff to remember. It only takes God 1 second to work out what he has been doing for years. It says that he was quickly summoned from the dungeon. Don't lose heart. Don't lose hope. Don't lose faith. Don't lose patience. No matter what it looks like. No matter what you see. Now, Pharaoh's dreams, he had actually 2 dreams. And remember, we've talked about this before. Whenever a phrase is repeated in the Bible, whenever God says something twice in the Bible, it's very, very important. And Pharaoh has 2 dreams, but it's 2 different ways of telling him the same thing. In the dream, Pharaoh sees 7 cows that are very fat and sleek. And then 7 real sickly, skinny cows come up and they devour. The sickly and skinny cows devour the 7 fat cows. And Joseph explains to Pharaoh, there's going to be 7 years of plenty. 7 years of plenty in Egypt. But after those 7 years, there will be 7 years of famine. So he says there's going to be 7 years of plenty. Then there's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh by now is like, well, obviously God's with you, so what do we do? And Joseph says, well, if I were you, I'd store up the stuff during the 7 lands of plenty so that we'll have something when the 7 years of famine come. So look what happens. Genesis chapter 41, starting with verse 41. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Gold's very important in the Bible. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, Make way! Thus, he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. So Joseph goes from prison to second in command in the most powerful nation in the world at this time. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name, I'll butcher this name, but he gave him a name. And he also gave him the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Now On is what we know as Heliopolis. That's kind of important in Egyptian mythology. But he gives him the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. How old was he when he had the dream? 17. So that's what? 13? So 13 years now have passed. Still, he has not seen the dream that God gave him come to fruition. 13 years have passed. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. So, we have the 7 years of plenty. Joseph has stored it up. Okay, we move now to chapter 41, starting with verse 53. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, just as God told Joseph it would. And the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands. This is important. This is important. Not only is there a famine in Egypt, but there's famine in all the other lands. But in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries, it's not just in Egypt that there's a famine, and all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. So, event number 13, Joseph is put in charge of Egypt. Event number 14, the famine is severe in all the world. We have at least 14 events now that God is orchestrating. All began with Joseph telling his brothers a dream, and they got mad and they sold him. So, Genesis chapter 42, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, Why do you just keep looking at each other? He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die. Now remember, they told Jacob that his son Joseph had died, had been killed. Okay. The 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt, but Jacob did not send Benjamin. You see, after Joseph had been sold by his brothers, Rachel, the woman that Jacob loved, Rachel had another son, Benjamin. So Joseph has a younger brother, Benjamin. Obviously, with Jacob believing that Joseph is now dead, Benjamin is the apple of Jacob's eye. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. It's now at least 23 years from the time Joseph had that dream to when he sees it actually come to fruition. 23 years. But his brothers are in front of him, bowing down to him. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Well, what would you do if you were Joseph at this moment? Remember, they wanted to kill him. But Reuben said, no, let's don't kill him. Instead, they sold him as a slave. And here they are bowing down in front of him. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. No, my lord, they answered. Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. No, he said to them, you have come to see where our land is unprotected. But they replied, your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more. And you know who the one they think is no more. It's the one that they're talking to. Joseph said to them, it is just as I told you, you are spies. And this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies. And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die. This they proceeded to do. Why do you think he wanted to see Benjamin so badly? Yeah. It's his little brother. There's only 2 that were born of Rachel. Him and Benjamin. They said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. How much time has passed? 23 years have passed, and look, it still haunts them. It still haunts them. But God is in charge. Don't let anything from your past haunt you. If you put your faith in the blood of Jesus, it's been redeemed. And God works out even our mistakes for our good. It doesn't mean we escape consequences. It doesn't mean we escape consequences. But He will work out even our mistakes for our good in the end. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." 23 years later, they're still haunted by what they've done. Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. Joseph spoke to them through an interpreter, but Joseph's listening to them, and he understands everything that they're saying. They're talking about him. He turned away from them and began to weep. But then turned back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. So remember, they came to buy food. Joseph not only gives them food, but he gives them their money back. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of his sack. "My silver has been returned," he said to his brothers. "Here it is in my sack." Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" They think they're going to be in trouble for this. When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. They said, "The man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men. We are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more. And the youngest is now with our father in Canaan.' Then the man who is Lord over the land said to us, 'This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me, and take food for your starving households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies, but honest men. Then I will give your brother back to you, and you can trade in the land.' As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. He'd given them all their money back. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them, 'You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me.' Then Reuben said to his father, 'You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back.' But Jacob said, 'My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left.'" He's the only one left. Jacob has 10 other sons. But these are the two that were born of Rachel, the woman that he loved. "If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow." Remember, Jacob was a cheater and a deceiver all of his life. He had an encounter with God, and he changed after that. God touched his hip, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life to remind him of his encounter with God. And last week I challenged any of you to find in Scripture where Jacob, now Israel, ever cheats anyone again after that encounter with God. Chapter 43. Now the famine was still severe in the land. So when they had eaten all the grain they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, "Go back and buy us a little more food." This is event number 16. They have to go back. But Judah said to him, By the way, what tribe is Jesus from as a human? The tribe of Judah. In human respect. But Judah said to him, "The man warned us solemnly, 'You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother along with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. Because the man said to us, you will not see my face again unless your brother is with you.'" Israel asked, "Why did you bring this trouble on me by telling the man you had another brother?" They replied, "The man questioned us closely about ourselves and our family. 'Is your father still living?' he asked." We know why he asked. "Do you have another brother?" We simply answered his questions. How were we to know what he would say? How were we to know he would say, "Bring your brother down here"? Then Judah said to Israel, his father, "Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and our children may live and not die." This is a matter of life and death for Jacob and his family. "I myself," this is Judah, "I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life. As it is, if we had not delayed, we could have gone and returned twice." Then their father Israel said to them, "If it must be, then do this. Put some of the best products of the land in your bags and take them down to the man as a gift. A little balm and a little honey, some spices and myrrh, some pistachio nuts." To me, that wouldn't be such a great gift, but to them it must have been. "And almonds. Take double the amount of silver with you." Take double the amount of silver with you. Remember, Jacob used to be a deceiver, but he's had an encounter with God. He's fair now. He says, "Take double the amount of silver with you, for you must return the silver that was put back into the mouths of your sacks." Proof that Jacob has indeed changed from his encounter with God. What does it say about us when we are born again? The old is gone, the new is here. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother also and go back to the man at once. And may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you. Remember, they had to leave Simeon. "As for me, I am bereaved. I am bereaved." So the men took the gifts and double the amount of silver, and Benjamin also. They hurried down to Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, "Take these men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare dinner. They are to eat with me at noon." The man did as Joseph told him and took the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were frightened when they were taken to his house. They thought, "We were brought here because of the silver that was put back into our sacks the first time. He wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys." Isn't that amazing how people who are not trustworthy do not trust others? So they went to Joseph's steward and spoke to him at the entrance of the house. "Please, sir," they said, "we came down here the first time to buy food. But at the place where we stopped for the night, we opened our sacks, and each of us found his silver, the exact weight in the mouth of his sack. So we have brought it back with us. We have also brought additional silver with us to buy food. We don't know who put our silver back in our sacks." "It's all right," he said. "Don't be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." Then he brought Simeon out to them. The steward took the men into Joseph's house, gave water to wash their feet, and provided fodder for their donkeys. They prepared their gifts for Joseph's arrival at noon, because they had heard they were to eat there. When Joseph came home, they presented to him the gifts they had brought into the house, and they bowed down before him to the ground for a second time now. He asked them how they were, and then he said, "How is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living?" They replied, "Your servant, our father, is still alive and well." And they bowed low to pay him honor. As he looked about and saw his brother Benjamin for the first time, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. After he had washed his face, he came out and, controlling himself, said, "Serve the food." They served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to Egyptians. The men had been seated before him in the order of their ages. The men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. When portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. They gave Benjamin 5 times as much. So they feasted and drank freely with him. Now, we must remember with me, God told Abraham, He said, "Abraham, know this, your descendants will be strangers in a land not their own, and they will be slaves for 400 years. God had told Abraham this. Know, Abraham, that your descendants will be strangers in a land not their own, and they will be slaves there for 400 years. God's providence, chapter 45, verse 4 through 8. I promise we're almost finished reading. Chapter 45, verses 4 through 8. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Remember, if Joseph hadn't ended up in Egypt, there would be no food for them to buy. They would have all died in Canaan. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land. And for the next 5 years, there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. If Joseph had not been sold, if Joseph hadn't told his brothers about the dream, if they had not sold him to the merchants, Joseph would not have ended up in Egypt. If Joseph hadn't been put in prison, and the cupbearer and the baker been put in prison with him and had their dreams, and Joseph not interpreted their dreams for them, so that the cupbearer, when Pharaoh had his dreams, the cupbearer could say, "I know a guy who can interpret your dreams, Pharaoh," and Joseph is summoned out of prison. If all of those things would not have happened, the people in Canaan, Joseph's family, Abraham's descendants, would have starved to death. Remember, it was Joseph's wisdom that told Pharaoh, "We have to store up all this grain because it's going to be fat in the land for 7 years." Remember the people down in Texas during the oil boom? Boy, I bet now they're wishing they'd have saved some of that money, because they lived like it was going to last forever, but it didn't. All of this, God was in charge of all of it. And Joseph realizes this. Chapter 45, verses 16 through 20. We're almost finished. You can tell on your notes we're almost finished. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." Not only do they get to leave their starving country, they get to go to Egypt, and they get the best part of Egypt. All because of Joseph. You are also directed to tell them, do this, take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours. So, finally, in chapter 46, finally, Jacob gets reunited with the firstborn son of the woman that he loved. The woman that he worked 7 years for, and it seemed like just a few days because of his love for her. And he ended up working 14 years for her, but he did it willingly. So Israel, remember, God changed Jacob's name to Israel. Which means what, Zach? He wrestles with God. Best ever from Oak Park right there. Sorry, Cody Brewer. So Israel set out with all that was his. And when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," he replied. "I am God, the God of your father," he said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father Jacob and their children and their wives in the carts that Pharaoh had sent to transport them. They also took with them their livestock and the possessions they had acquired in Canaan. And Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt. He took with him to Egypt his sons and grandsons and his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring. They all get to go to Egypt and live in the best land of Egypt. And God says, "I will make you a great nation in Egypt," which he does. The last scripture for today is Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. This is Joseph. He's reassuring his brothers. Now, I would imagine that his brothers are probably walking on eggshells. Oh man, Joseph, this is Joseph, and look what we did to him. And he's the second in command. Joseph reassures his brothers. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Let me tell you something I've learned, and I hope it doesn't take you as long to learn it as it took me. There's freedom in forgiveness. There's freedom in forgiveness. If somebody's done something to you, it doesn't matter what it is. First of all, it doesn't matter how bad it is, whatever they've done. God can heal it. God can heal you, no matter what's happened. There's freedom in forgiveness. If we do not forgive, we ourselves are choosing to stay in bondage ourselves. And sometimes the hardest person on earth to forgive is yourself. Sometimes God has to help us to even forgive ourselves. But that's what he wants. That's why Jesus went to the cross. Joseph says, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" By the way, if you refuse to forgive yourself, you're putting yourself in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Doesn't matter what anyone's done to you. God will work it out for good. And that's why I put the verse in Romans in your notes so you can take it with you. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. It took 23 years for Joseph's dreams to be realized. And we know that the Israelites became a great nation in Egypt, but as the years went by, this Pharaoh dies. The next Pharaoh doesn't think so kindly of Joseph and his relatives. And the Israelites do find themselves in slavery. They do find themselves in slavery. Just like God told Abraham. But God's still in charge. He's still in charge. God knows about Moses. He knows all the things he's going to do. God is bigger than the problem. He's bigger than the mistake. He's even bigger than the dream. Whatever dream you have, God has dreamed a dream for you himself. He's bigger than the dream even. Don't lose heart. Don't lose hope. Don't lose faith. Don't lose patience. Trust that God is in control. Thank you for being here. You are a blessing. Let's pray.